Well, I want to welcome all of you who are joining in with us for the final week of Restart. Welcome to those of you at Madras and Northgate and those joining in online. We've been in this series, believe it or not, since the beginning of January. And if you're just joining in today, let me see if I can catch you up on what we've been doing. We said way back at the start that this series was about the fact that all of us begin to develop faith, our way of understanding the world and God and ourselves when we're kids. Some of us got that because somebody gave it to us, our parents or somebody who loved us took us to a place and we were instructed, and that's a good thing. I did that for my kids. I hope you're doing that for yours. And we developed faith that way. Others of us, we didn't have anybody in our family who really had faith, and so we had to just pick it up on our own. But we did. We picked up how God is, how the world is, how we are, how other people are in general. And then, when we get to be adults, the same thing happens for all of us. We begin to see things that we didn't see as children. We see the world in a different way. We see things in a different light about God. We see ourselves different. We see some things or we do some things, and they shake our childhood faith. And for some of you, it wasn't that big a deal. You sort of were able to figure out how that all fit in, and you adapted your faith, and you said, I just believe. But for others of us, we couldn't do that as easily, and we just couldn't figure out how it all fit together, and we didn't have it all right, so we didn't want to just act like we didn't believe anything, but really we just sort of counted faith as a category over here, and it's relevant for what it is, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And then there's real life, because I got stuff to do. I got to make a living. I got to raise kids. I got to have a job, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of it, we said, what if all of us, as adults, we could push a button, we could push the restart button, and we could find a place where we could all restart our faith? So we've been talking about that now, and today's the final week. And we're about to get to the exciting conclusion of the series, Restart. And you could just go back, and if you missed any of them, they all do sort of build on each other. You could watch all of them at once. You could binge watch the Restart series there at your house. So here's what we've talked about so far. Week one, we said that the place to restart your faith as a Christian is not with the question, is the Bible true, or did Noah get dinosaurs on the ark? Those may be interesting questions for debate, but those not the place of Christianity. In fact, nobody who became a Christian in the beginning ever talked about those things. Instead, what they talked about was, who is Jesus? That's the question you need to get answered. And what about his resurrection? Who is Jesus, and what is his resurrection? What does that say to me? How does that impact my life? Then week two, we talked about ourselves, and we said, the truth about us is we're not just people who make mistakes. Oh, I made some mistakes. The truth is it's deeper than that. We aren't just mistakers. The truth is, if it's a mistake, you can just fix it. But for many of us, there are things that we've done that we can't seem to stop doing. It's not just a mistake. The truth about all of us is we're not mistakers. We're sinners. And then on the third week, we talked about how rules fit into with our relationship with God, and the fact that in Christianity, it's not a club mentality of rules or an HOA kind of mentality of rules. It's a family model of rules, that you have rules because you're in the family, you're in relationship, that the rules come. And then we talked about what can wash away our sin, our shame. How can I overcome that? And then in week 5, we talked about this thing called grace, which is really unique just to Christianity among world religions, this idea of grace. And grace, when you fully understand it, it feels like you're sort of slipping one by on God. And then last week we talked about the nature of belief and faith itself, and how Christianity, again, is unique among world religions in that we don't just have a group of believe that's. Instead, Christianity is not just a group of people thinking a whole bunch of group think, and we just reinforce each other. Instead, Christianity is based on an event. Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Who is Jesus, again, and was he resurrected? And that brings us all the way to today. And today, I need to talk to you about one final thing, and it's a really important thing that if you're considering following Jesus, you really need to take this into account. And even for some of you who are followers of Jesus, because of the way our culture and churches have talked about this part that is a part of what it means to follow Jesus is clearly in the story of following Jesus in the Bible. That in our culture, Christians, Christ followers, have been taught that this is almost optional, that because we're taught about personal faith, that this part is called optional, but it's not optional. It's a part of what it means to follow Jesus. And as you're considering this, I want to talk to you about this thing. And I want to talk to you about something that happened, and in fact, something that continues to happen. And then I think the only way that you can explain that it continues to happen is the fact that Jesus really is alive, what he said did come to pass, and that he is actively involved in the lives of people today. So here's what happened. A few weeks or so before Jesus is going to be crucified, and the followers don't know that yet. He's telling them, but they don't believe him. They're actually with Jesus about 150 miles north of Jerusalem in a city called Caesarea Philippi. I can show you a picture of Caesarea Philippi. It doesn't look today like it did then. Back then it looked a lot better. It was a thriving Roman city right in the heart of Judea. It's called Caesarea Philippi because it was named after Augustus Caesar. And I've told you before, Augustus Caesar was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. And when Julius Caesar died, the Roman Senate deified him. They declared him to have been divine. So the coming of Augustus Caesar then was the coming of the Son of God. He was the coming of the Son of God, Augustus Caesar. And so this city is a place of huge emperor worship. In fact, that cave that you can see in the photo actually was called the Gates of Hades. That cave was the entrance to the Gates of Hades and was a part of the whole emperor worship. It was a part considered the entrance to the place of the dead. And this city was a place where Augustus was worshipped. Because he's God, he was worshipped there. So Jesus and his guys are in this city, and Jesus starts having a little conversation with them. He talks to them about, hey, I know who people say Augustus is. He's the Son of God, they say. But what I want to know is, who do they say I am? And so they begin to give him feedback, and they give some interesting responses. Oh, some think you're John the Baptist, which is interesting because John the Baptist is already dead, but maybe, news doesn't travel as fast in that part of the world, and they think this is the prophet they've heard about that's baptizing in the Jordan. Other people think he's a reincarnated kind of prophet. And then Jesus sort of turns and says, but the real question is, who do you say I am? And Peter, being, sort of the outspoken one in the group, he just blurts out, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus says, Peter, that's really good. You got it exactly right. I am the Son of the living God. But you also need to know you're smart, but you're not that smart. You didn't get that on your own. Peter, you got that because God himself gave you that answer. That's who I am. And then I want to show you something that Jesus says that really is at the center of what we need to talk about today and focus on today. It's the deal for today. Jesus makes a prediction, and it's hard to exaggerate, really, the significance of his prediction. He says, on this rock, Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not stand against it. Now, the significance of that statement is that it's a prediction about the church. This prediction he makes about the church. Now, you need to know Jesus speaks in Aramaic. Most likely that's the common language of the Judean people, so he's speaking in Aramaic. But when Matthew writes this book, it's 30 years, 40 years later, and he writes in the official language of the world at that time, it's Greek. And so he writes the book in Greek. So he thinks about what he heard Jesus say. He's standing there when Jesus says it. He thinks about the word that we get, the word translated church for us. He thinks about that word, and he can't say the Aramaic word because some of you know when you translated words, there's not words that they don't just translate perfectly. So he chooses the word ecclesia. And ecclesia, you should know, is not like a religious word. It's just a word. And it means gathering. It means following. It means, assembly. It means congregation. So what you need to know is Jesus says, I'm making a prediction on this statement that you made that I'm the Christ, the Son of the God. I'm going to build my gathering, my assembly, my congregation, the people that follow me. And the gates of hell, the gates of Hades, the gates of death, it won't stand against it. Now, again, I just wish we could picture the context. It's Jesus and the 12 guys, maybe a handful of others. They're standing around this bustling place or that cave. There's this big emperor worship going on. And Jesus says, I'm going to build my gathering. Like that guy. I'm going to build my gathering of people on that statement. And they look around and they're like, It's just us. I don't think you could sort of call this a gathering. But the interesting thing is what happens next. And the tragedy of what happens next is really the translation about that particular word. Because what does happen is there is a congregation that comes along. As I told you last week, Jesus is crucified and then he's resurrected. And not many days after that, a gathering starts, a following starts, a movement gets started in Jesus' name. And eventually, just to give you the scope and size of it, 300 years after Jesus makes this prediction, the Romans who crucified Jesus, they adopt worship of Jesus as the official Roman worship, not emperor worship. That happens after this prediction. The disciples don't know what's going to happen, but it happens. And so then that's when they begin to collect all these writings of the apostles, and they put them together about that time, 250, 300 years later, into a book. And now they're going to translate them into languages all over the world. And it comes down to about 1,500 years later where they're in the European countries, and they're going to translate it in the European tongues. And now they're taking this word ecclesia, and they're going to have to translate it. And it's really hard to get an exact meaning into the language. So they choose a German word that doesn't really mean the same thing, but they superimpose it on ecclesia. It's a word, I won't try to say it because every time I try to say it, people speak German say I murder it. But it sounds like church. That's the word that they choose. But again, you need to know, it doesn't mean assembly. It doesn't mean gathering. It doesn't mean a people. Instead, it means the house of the Lord. And what happens is, through the years, as this gets translated and it begins eventually become just accepted that the word is now this church word that gets superimposed, the idea of the Jesus movement, the Jesus assembly, the Jesus congregation gets lost, and instead we have this word, house of the Lord, superimposed on it. And so many people begin to think about the church as a place, as an institution. But you need to understand, Jesus did not predict an institution. He did not predict a place. Jesus predicted a movement, a people, a congregation, a following. Matthew knew that, so he chose the word ecclesia. I will tell you that there's a hero along the way when it comes to translating into our language into English for the first time. There's a guy named William Tyndale. And Tyndale, instead of going with the European translations that are already in place and then translating English from those, he goes back to the original Greek. And when he gets to this verse, he sees the word Matthew chose, ecclesia, and he realizes, oh no, everybody's got it wrong. It doesn't mean house of the Lord, institution, building, a place. It means a people. So when William Tyndale first translates the Bible into English, he says, I will build my congregation. He changes it back to the original meaning. But it's the Middle Ages, and the institution of the church has great power, and the people in power in the church, eventually they arrest and kill William Tyndale because of his translation, and it all goes back. Well, you just need to know, after Jesus makes, back to the Matthew story, he makes this prediction, and they're standing in Caesarea Philippi. They get up and they head back to Jerusalem. And the disciples try to talk Jesus out of it because they know there's this rising turmoil in Jerusalem that he's not liked, and the leaders are against him, and something bad's going to happen. But he keeps saying to them, I've got to go and I'm going to die, but they don't get it, and they try to stop him. And finally, one of the writers about his life says he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Like I said to you last week, when he gets there, he dies. He's crucified on the cross. And on Friday, if you'd come up to Peter and said, Peter, do you still believe what you said weeks earlier about Jesus in Caesarea Philippi? Do you still believe that he's the Christ, the Son of the living God? Peter would have said, we had hoped. We had hoped that he was, but it's obvious he wasn't, because he died. And all that stuff he said about an assembly, a following, a congregation, all of that died with him. But then, of course, Jesus is resurrected. And as we said last week, just a few weeks later, these men who were cowardly and ran away and were afraid for their lives when Jesus is arrested and crucified, they stand in the city where Jesus is crucified and he's killed, and where he's resurrected, and they say, Jesus was the Son of God. You killed him. But God raised him from the dead. We have seen him. Now everybody needs to follow him. In fact, one day Jesus is talking with them before he goes back to heaven. And he says these words to them. We're told later that at the point he's with 500, but at this point I think he's just with his followers, and he says to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now, I just say there aren't many places where you can stand up and say all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, and anybody take you seriously. But if you're a guy who predicted your own death and then you died and you said that when you die you're going to come back from the grave, if you say all of that and you pull it off, if you're standing and listening to that guy say all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, I probably listen to that guy. So he says, based on all of that, all authority on heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, I can ask you to do anything. I have all authority. Therefore, I have all authority to make you do whatever I want you to do. Here's what I want you to do. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. Do what? I mean, we don't have any connections. Yeah, you got resurrected, but I mean, they still hate you. We don't have any power. We're going to be all alone. What do we have? You have me. All authority. So I want you to go. I want you to go to all people groups. I want you to go everywhere. I want you to go everywhere in the world, and you don't even know much beyond Judea, but I want you to go everywhere. And I want you to tell everybody about what God has done in my resurrection, and I want you to help them become a part of the assembly, of the following. I want you to become a part of the congregation of Jesus' followers. And surely I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. And then he's gone. In fact, I've always thought that part of the verse was a little funny. He says, here's what I want you to do, and I'll be with you forever. Got to go. I'm gone. And he's done. And then they go back to Jerusalem, and they wait for 10 days. And just like Jesus predicted to them then, the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and they go into the streets, and they begin to say to people, Jesus was God's son. You killed him. God resurrected. We have seen him. Now you need to turn your life around and you need to follow him. And on that first day when they begin to say it, the gathering is born. The movement of Jesus' followers starts that day in Jerusalem. And it becomes that day with thousands of people in that city where Jesus was killed. Not somewhere on the other side of the planet. Not years later. 50 days later. They become a part of this Jesus congregation. And it grew and it grew and it grew, and the people of Jesus are born. But just to be clear, the people of Jesus are not born around a set of truth claims of Jesus said that all people are equal, and Jesus said we should love everybody, and let the little children come to me, and we should care for people everywhere, not because of any of those truth claims of how God was. The people of Jesus were born around an event, that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and they went everywhere and told everybody. The movement was moving. Now, I said they went everywhere. The truth is, even though the movement was moving, it hadn't really moved that far, even though it was going pretty good. In fact, there comes a point where they haven't really gone so very far, and the movement starts moving a few years into it. And then persecution comes, and the little assembly that is formed there in Jerusalem and Judea, it gets scattered into further parts of Palestine. And the movement gets moving again. But then again, it breaks down, and really it just stops there in Palestine. Jesus had said to them, go into the whole world, and what they had decided to do is sort of like go to their neighborhood. They had really broken this whole thing of going outside of people who were Jewish. And so God reaches down, and he chooses a man. And I think in God's sense of humor, he chooses the man who at the time is trying to do everything he can to stamp out the Jesus assembly. He chooses a guy who is a devout follower of the same God the Christians follow, but he doesn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. He follows a guy who's so well educated and who is so devout to God that he thinks it's his mission to honor the God that he loves, that he puts every Jesus follower, a whole part of the assembly, that he just stamps it out. His name is Saul. And Jesus appears to him personally, and he's blinded, and he has this dramatic conversion, and he becomes a devout follower of Jesus. And Jesus says to him, now, Paul, I want you to go, and I want you to take this to non-Jewish people all over the world. You're dramatically converted. I want you to go now everywhere, and I want you to tell everybody outside the Jewish community. But Lord, I'm like the Jews' Jew. I'm the Pharisee of the Pharisees. I know. And because you're so well educated, and because they know your background, and because you're already a Roman citizen, and because you have the ability to stand in front of groups of people, and because you're so zealous, I'm going to choose you. You're so zealous that I thought you might stamp out the whole assembly by yourself. And now I'm choosing you, one guy, to take it to the rest of the world. And he does. Paul gets the movement moving again, and he went to the whole known world. He'd start first by going into cities, and he'd tell any group of scattered Jews there in their synagogue about their Messiah, Jesus, that had come. And then when he didn't get the hearing he'd want there, even after he did, he'd go out into all the Greek-speaking people, and he'd tell them about what God had done for all people in raising a man from the dead, and that God wanted all people to now follow him. And he went throughout Greece, and he went to Italy, and he basically went in every port city around the Mediterranean world. He started these little outposts all the way to Spain. Paul's starting these little ecclesia after ecclesia, little gatherings of Jesus' movement as they impact the world for disciples of Christ. And then one day, he's arrested, and he's taken to Rome. Actually, it's the second time that Paul gets taken to Rome. Once he's taken to Rome, and on his own, he sort of asked to be taken, appeals to Rome, and then he's released. But this time he gets arrested, and he's not going to be released. This is going to be the last time for Paul. And you really have to think about this. I mean, their world is, this ancient world is so vastly different than ours. This is a world where the rule of one man, at that time it's a guy named Nero. He's the emperor. And the word of one man can change anything in a moment. It's different from our world. And I think Paul's probably sitting in jail. It's the second time he's sitting in that jail. But he knows what Nero's doing. He knows how Nero's persecuting Christians. He knows how his brothers and sisters are dying. And he sees the assembly scattering. And he has to be thinking, I wonder if he sits in that jail cell and he thinks, have the last 30 years been worth it? Have the last 30 years of me following Jesus and telling everybody else to follow Jesus, did it work? Have we made an impact? Is the assembly going to make it? Or will they just kill us all? Will the Romans just finally wipe us out? And then one morning, probably before sunup, the guards come and they put chains on Paul and they lead him out to the square. And it's his last day. Now imagine for a second if you and I could have gone back in time and we could have gone into that cell before the guards come and before they take him away, before they're going to kill him. And we said to Paul, don't be discouraged. It worked. Paul, it worked. I'm here from the future. And I've been to Rome in the future, Paul, and I know it's hard for you to believe, but the forum where you stood trial, the forum where you stood before that crazy man Nero, it's a ruin now. And Paul, from the forum, you can see building after building where an assembly of Jesus followers meets. And Paul, the city of Rome, which in your day is the center that has statues dedicated to men who claim to be God, and they make everybody worship them, and they'll kill anybody who doesn't worship them. They're just ordinary men, but they claim to be God. Now, Paul, in that one city, it has more buildings dedicated to the worship of Jesus as Lord than you can imagine. Paul, in the future, in this city where they're going to kill you, in this city, in the city of Rome, if you stand on the top of the hills and you look out on the top of the buildings, in this city you will see more crosses on the top of buildings than you could possibly imagine. And Paul, they don't have crosses on top of the building to remind us of the power of the Roman government. They're on there to remind us of what Jesus did on the cross. They're to mark a little outpost of the Jesus assembly that's all over this place. And Paul, you know Nero's circus? You know that horrible place that he created where he'd have Christians come in and they'd be thrown to the lions, and he'd dip them in tar so they could be lighted as torches so he could watch the gladiators kill more Christians. On the foundation of Nero's circus, they built a building, one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, even in our day, Paul. And they named it after your friend. They call it St. Peter's Basilica. And you know, Paul, one day thousands of people all over the world, they'll come to this place and they'll want to see
where you spent your last hours in this particular cell, Paul, it was worth it. The books you wrote, the movement you started, the way that Jesus gave it to you and you took it to the whole world. Paul, I'm from the other side of the planet. I speak a total other language, and yet I follow Jesus just like you did. There is no Roman Empire these days, Paul, but the Jesus movement is thriving all over the world. Paul, I know it's hard for you to believe, but one day the only way anybody will even, most people in our world will even know the name Caesar Augustus is he's a footnote when they read the birth of the story of our Lord Jesus Christ. And one day, Paul, people will name their sons after you. All over the world, people will name their sons Paul, and they'll name their dogs after Caesar. I don't think Paul or Peter or any of the other, those who stood with Jesus that day in Caesarea Philippi could imagine any of that. But what Jesus said had come true. The gates of Hades, the center of emperor worship, it would not stand against this assembly that he would start, this movement of Jesus. In fact, no power has been able to stand against it. Could they imagine that the Roman Colosseum now would be in ruin, and in the center of it would hang a cross to honor the martyrs who had died there? Could they imagine any of this? I don't see how they could have, but it happened. I mean, don't miss this. It happened. It's recorded history. It's not something we believe. It happened. People know it. Just as Jesus predicted that it would, it came to pass. Because there outside the city of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus and a handful of followers, Jesus said, I'm going to build my people, my assembly, my congregation of believers, and the gates of Hades, hell, death itself will not stand against it. Built on the fact that I'm the Son of God. Because my Spirit will fill it. My presence will inhabit it. And the church will be the center of the activity of God in the world on this planet until the end of the age, as I am with my people, my assembly, my followers. And they will go into all nations, and they will help people, and they will help people come to be followers of Jesus all over the world. Now, this is something you need to consider as you're restarting your faith. You can consider a lot of belief systems and a lot of truth claims, but at some point you have to deal with two things, not that someone believes, but two things that happened. There was a group of people in Jerusalem. It's a verifiable fact that when Jesus said he was killed, they said, we have seen Jesus resurrected from the dead. And then generations of people have followed this movement of people that has grown and grown and grown and expanded just as Jesus predicted that it would. And here's the best part, I think. We have been invited to be a part of the activity of God in this world. Christianity is not about just you and your relationship with God. You and I have been invited to participate in the activity of God in the world. And we do this by following Jesus, and we join a local group of Jesus followers, and we realize that what happens in the assembly, in the gathering, in the following, in the people of God, and the Jesus followers is what God is up to in the world. God's moving through the compassion of the church. Through the message of the church, he's bringing light into darkness. Through compassion, he's helping people that are poor and needy in their world. Through those of us who are sinners, he's bringing light and hope through his church as we are changed. Through the interaction of the church with people in our community and through those we influence that we work with. And of course, the church hasn't always been right. Of course the church has dark days. And yes, the church has been responsible for some terrible tragedies in our world. And it continues to be filled with problems, with horrible, embarrassing stories. But isn't that a part of the point? I mean, in spite of sinners like me, not just people out there who are embarrassed by what they do, but in spite of people like me, the church continues to move forward and it continues to thrive. The movement of Jesus people, the Jesus congregation, continues to grow and grow and grow. And that doesn't happen because we're smart. It doesn't happen because we figured out some great strategy. It happens because Jesus said, I will build my assembly, my people, and no power will stand against it. And you have been invited to be a part of what God is doing in the world. What God is doing on this planet through his people. In fact, I think the question to end this series, Restart, is the question that all of us have to wrestle with is, what's my next step with that? What's my next step? For some of you, your next step is just to continue to come. You've only been coming for just a little bit, and for you, it's just to continue to come and listen and to figure it out. You're at a place where you haven't figured out the question. Who is Jesus? And what about his resurrection? For others of you, that's not the next step for you. The next step is it's for you to follow. I mean, you've got that question answered. You have other questions. You don't have all your questions answered. Who does? But you have that question answered, and you know that somewhere during this series, something came alive in you. Something sparked in you. And it's time for you to follow. There are others that you would say that you're already followers of Christ, but you haven't done the one thing that Jesus asked all followers to do. You haven't been baptized. You haven't done what Jesus said to do to Matthew when he said, go and make disciples and baptize them. So your next step would be that I'm going to follow Jesus in the way that he asked, and I'm going to be baptized. And some of you were baptized when you were children because your parents wanted that to happen, but Jesus said after you believe, to go and make followers, they believe, and then they're baptized. So you need to make a decision on your own after having believed that you personally want to follow Jesus. For others of you who've done that, but honestly, your main involvement with the following of Jesus, with the gathering of Jesus, is what you're doing right now. You come and you sit in rows and you listen, and honestly, you're not even really that devoted to that. You come some. Some of you are very devoted to that, but that's about it. Don't you get it? Don't you understand? You've been invited. This is not about just you and God. You've been invited. In fact, following Jesus means you're a part of, included in, what God is doing through his people in the world, what he's been doing for 2,000 years. And you need to serve. You need to find a place where you're needed. And you go, well, they don't really need what I want to do. That doesn't matter. I mean, it's not about you. It's about the body. What does the assembly need? What does the group need? You need to serve because God has included you in his body, in the assembly, in the part of the movement of God, and you are needed what you could bring. You need to be a part of a group, not just so you can get something from the group, but what the group could get from you as a part of the body as you connect with them. For some of you, your next step is even bigger than that. For sometimes some of you have been wrestling with what can only be explained as what you think is a call from God. You sense that God wants you to do something bigger, a whole new direction with your life, to devote your life in a whole different kind of way. Whatever your next step is, you've been invited. You were included. You've been invited to participate in the activity of God in the world. And when you give yourself to the church, you give yourself to the one thing that God is up to on the planet Earth. The church is the hope of the world. Because the church has been invested with the message of Jesus, and Jesus changes people and the world. And when people change, families change, and communities change, and nations change, and the world changes. And all of us have been invited, not just to follow Jesus solo, but a part of following Jesus is we've been invited to participate in his gathering, his people, his movement. Yes, we want you to make a decision to restart your faith and make a personal decision to follow Jesus. But you need to understand that your personal decision to follow Jesus involves and has always involved a bigger decision as well. Following Jesus has always meant you were included as a part of the Jesus people and the Jesus assembly. It means being a part of what God is doing through that movement in the world. And it's not simply a responsibility. It's a privilege. It's an opportunity to partner with God in the only thing that He's doing in our world. So whatever your next step, you take that step and you'll never regret it. And it'll be the place where you restart your faith. Let's bow together. Father in heaven, thank you for Jesus, for His love for us, for His willingness to come for us, for His resurrection, for the event that triggered, that launched this movement that's come all the way now to us. I thank you for the people for 2,000 years that have served in this movement, have led this movement, who got this movement all the way to the point where I became a follower of Jesus. And I'm thankful that I've been included, that you've allowed me to be a part of it. I pray that you will help my brothers and sisters, those who follow Jesus, to understand their part in where they need to go, their step and they need to take. Father, thank you for your love for us, and receive our worship as we remember you now. In your Son's name I pray. Amen.